Hi guys, we continue our quest of trying to understand Rishi Aurobindo's philosophies from his book The Life Divine, and today we start a chapter called Delight of Existence, the Problem, because the next chapter is called Delight of Existence, the Solution. This is the 11th chapter in the book, and as usual he starts off with a quote from an Upanishad. It's from the Taittiriya Upanishad. It's called, "For who could live or breathe if there were not this delight of existence as the ether in which we dwell? From delight all these beings are born. By delight they exist and grow. To delight they return." The quote ends. And now Rishi Aurobindo writes, "But even if we accept this pure existence, this Brahman, this Sat, as the absolute beginning, end and continent of things, and in Brahman an inherent self-consciousness inseparable from its being and throwing itself out as a force of movement of consciousness, which is creative of forces, forms and worlds, we have yet no answer to the question, why should Brahman, perfect, absolute, infinite, needing nothing, desiring nothing, at all throw out force of consciousness to create in itself these worlds of forms? For we have put aside the solution that it is compelled by its own nature of force to create, obliged by its own potentiality of movement and formation to move into forms. It is true that it has this potentiality, but it is not limited, bound or compelled by it. It is free. If then, being free to move or remain eternally still, to throw itself into forms or retain the potentiality of form in itself, it indulges its power of movement and formation, it can be only for one reason: for delight. This primary, ultimate and eternal existence, as seen by the Vedantins, is not merely bare existence, or a conscious existence whose consciousness is crude force or power. It is a conscious existence, the very term of whose being, the very term of whose consciousness is bliss. As in absolute existence there can be no nothingness, no night of inconscience, no deficiency, that is to say, no failure of force. For if there were any of these things, it would not be absolute. So as also there can be no suffering, no negation of delight. Absoluteness of conscious existence is illimitable bliss of conscious existence. Absoluteness of conscious existence is illimitable bliss of conscious existence. The two are only different phrases for the same thing. All illimitableness, all infinity, all absoluteness is pure delight. Even our relative humanity has this experience that all dissatisfaction means a limit, an obstacle. Satisfaction comes by realization of something withheld, by the surpassing of the limit, the overcoming of the obstacle. This is because our original being in the Absolute, in full possession of its infinite and illimitable self-consciousness and self-power, a self-possession whose other name is self-delight, and in proportion as the relative touches upon the self-possession, it moves towards satisfaction, touches delight. The self-delight of Brahman is not limited, however, by the still and motionless possession of its absolute self-being. The self-delight of Brahman is not limited, however, by the still and motionless possession of its absolute self-being. Just as its force of consciousness is capable of throwing itself into forms infinitely and with an endless variation, so also its self-delight is capable of movement, of variation, of reveling in that infinite flux and mutability of itself represented by numberless teeming universes. To lose forth and enjoy this infinite movement and variation of its self-delight is the object of its extensive or creative play of force. In other words, that which has thrown itself out into forms is a triune existence consciousness bliss, or Satchidananda, Sat Chit Ananda, existence consciousness bliss, whose consciousness is in its nature a creative, or rather a self-expressive force capable of infinite variation in phenomenon and form of its self-conscious being and endlessly enjoying the delight of that variation. it follows that all things that exist are what they are as terms of that existence, terms of that conscious force, terms of that delight of being. Just as we find all things to be mutable forms of one immutable being, finite results of one infinite force, so we shall find that all things are variable self-expression of one invariable and all-embracing delight of self-existence. In everything that is dwells the conscious force, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that conscious force. This sentence needs to be read again. In everything that is dwells the conscious force, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that conscious force. Remember the phrase, conscious force. So also in everything that is, there is the delight of existence, and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that delight. This ancient Vedantic theory of cosmic origins is immediately confronted in the human mind by two powerful contradictions: the emotional and sensational consciousness of pain and the ethical problem of evil. Because if the world is an expression of Satchidananda, not only of existence, that is conscious force, because that can easily be admitted, but of existence that is also infinite self-delight, how are we to account for the universal presence of grief, of suffering, of pain? Because this world appears to us rather as a world of suffering than as a world of delight, of existence. Certainly, that view of the world is an exaggeration, an error of perspective. If we regard it dispassionately and with a sole view to accurate and unemotional appreciation, we shall find that the sum of the pleasure of existence far exceeds the sum of the pain of existence. Appearances and individual cases to the contrary notwithstanding, and that the active or passive surface or underlying pleasure of existence is the normal state of nature, pain a contrary occurrence temporarily suspending or overlaying that normal state. But for that very reason, the lesser sum of pain affects us more intensely and often looms larger than the greater sum of pleasure. Precisely because the latter is normal, we do not treasure it, hardly even observe it unless it intensifies into some acuter form of itself, into a wave of happiness, a crest of joy or ecstasy. It is these things that we call delight and seek the normal satisfaction of existence, which is always there, regardless of event and particular cause or object, affects us as something neutral which is neither pleasure nor pain. It is there, a great practical fact, for without it there would not be the universal and overpowering instinct of self-preservation. But it is not what we seek, and therefore we do not enter it into our balance of emotional and sensational profit and loss. In that balance we enter only positive pleasures on one side and discomfort and pain on the other. Pain affects us more intensely because it is abnormal to our being, contrary to our natural tendency, and is experienced as an outrage on our existence, an offense, an external attack on what we are and seek to be. Nevertheless, the abnormality of pain, or its greater or... Let me underline this phrase, what a beautiful line. Nevertheless, the abnormality of pain, because it's the exception, not the rule, the pain, or its greater or lesser sum, does not affect the philosophical issue. Greater or less, its mere presence constitutes the whole problem. All being Satchidananda, how can pain and suffering at all exist? This, the real problem, is often further confused by a false issue starting from the idea of a personal extracosmic God and a partial issue, the ethical difficulty. Personal extracosmic God. Satchidananda, it may be reasoned, is God, is a conscious being who is the author of existence. How then can God have created a world in which He inflicts suffering on His creatures, sanctions pain, permits evil? God being all good, who created pain and evil? If we say that pain is a trial and an ordeal, we do not solve the moral problem, we arrive at an immoral or non-moral God. An excellent world mechanist perhaps, a cunning psychologist, but not a God of good and of love whom we can worship, only a God of might to whose law we must submit or whose caprice we may hope to propitiate. Because one who invents torture as a means of test or ordeal stands convicted either of being either of deliberate cruelty or of moral insensibility, and if a moral being at all, is inferior to the highest instinct of his own creatures. And if to escape this moral difficulty we say that pain is an inevitable result and natural punishment of moral evil, listen to this once again. And if to escape this moral difficulty we say that pain is an inevitable result and natural punishment of moral evil, an explanation which will not even square with the facts of life unless we admit the theory of karma and rebirth by which the soul suffers now for antenatal sins in other bodies, we still do not escape the very root of the ethical problem. Who created or why or whence was created that moral evil which entails the punishment of pain and suffering? Why did that come about anyway? And seeing that moral evil is in reality a form of mental disease or ignorance, who or what created this law or inevitable connection which punishes a mental disease or act of ignorance by a recoil so terrible, by tortures often so extreme and monstrous? The inexorable law of karma is irreconcilable with the supreme moral and personal deity, and therefore the clear logic of Buddha denied the existence of any free and all-governing personal God. All personality he declared to be a creation of ignorance and subject to karma. In truth, the difficulty thus sharply presented arises only if we assume the existence of an extra-cosmic personal God. He now gets to the point. All the problem is arising because we are thinking of an extra-cosmic personal God, like the old guy sitting in the sky and judging you for everything you do in the entire day. Not himself the universe, one who has created good and evil, pain and suffering for his creatures, but himself stands above and unaffected by them, watching, ruling, doing his will with a suffering and struggling world, or if not doing his will, if allowing the world to be driven by an inexorable law, unhelped by him or inefficiently helped, then not God, not omnipotent, not all good and all loving. So essentially the Abrahamic concept of God, as far as I'm understanding so far. On no theory of an extra-cosmic moral God can evil and suffering be explained. The creation of evil and suffering, except by an unsatisfactory subterfuge which avoids the question at issue instead of answering it, or a plain or implied Manichaeism which practically annuls the Godhead in attempting to justify its ways or excuse its works. But such a God is not the Vedantic Satchidananda. What a great phrase. This is very important. I need to keep this entire section underlined.